So on this topic, what are the books that we have to have on our reading list?
So one of the things that I thought would be useful for us to think about very briefly, given our focus, is the 1982 essay by Dan Rogers, In Search of Progressivism, and then also what we see, Nancy and I, in our introduction to the Gilded Age Companion, but also I think a lot of us teach and think a lot about. Dan Rogers is sort of three main clusters of ideas that help to unify many of the movements and patterns and trends of the era. They're not perfect, but I think they work pretty neatly. And so one is social efficiency, another is the rhetoric of anti-monopolism, and a third is the emphasis on social bonds. And this model, he argued, suggested a kind of active, dynamic aspect of, progressive ideas in the plural, right? And that these ideas go back to Twain and Warner in the 1870s, right? So they're much they transcend the period itself from the 1870s up to about 1920, and they also encapsulate some of those core questions that we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation. Some of the things that are very much with us today about how to regulate, questions of inequality and racial injustice and structural racism, how to grapple with, the power of special interests in society, what it means to embody American ideals in foreign policy, for instance, and social justice abroad being something out there. Social harmony, what does that even mean? Are calls for equity useful, or are they actually fundamentally divisive in kinds of ways that progressives would have understood? And I think, some folks that say, David Hollinger has written about in the 80s and 90s, who emphasized multiculturalism, would have forgotten about that. They weren't thinking in the same terms that progressives were, or had the capacity to, self-styled progressives in that period. So it's useful, I think, to get out a couple of those kind of structuring concepts, or some of the ways that the era has been structured.
I think that is a really useful article. One that I use a lot is Peter Feinlein's Obituary for the Progressive Movement. It was written in 1970. And I start my my seminar with this. So it's like, so they have to read this obituary, and then it's like, okay, is there a progressive era? What, so how can we justify, this course? So that it's a great starting place. And then it's also at the end of the quarter, it's also kind of a great place to revisit. All right, so it's still problematic after 10 weeks of discussing all these things and so forth. But so rather than arguing for it, arguing against it, I think kind of can help shape as well, and get people thinking sort of creatively.
Yeah, so I suppose I'd say for people who want a sweeping take on the era, particularly, say, interested students, scholars who don't work in the period, perhaps, or fellow U.S. scholars, I'd go with Rebecca Edwards's book, New Spirits, Maureen Flanagan's book, America Reformed, Jackson Lears, Rebirth of a Nation, are all really good. I like Glenda Gilmore's edited volume, which has primary sources and some select secondary sources, mostly select secondary sources. Who Were the Progressives? I think that's pretty good. We've mentioned a few here. I'd certainly dive into some of the biographies of the era. One that I found really fascinating and read over the holidays last year was Goddess of Anarchy, about the life and times of Lucy Parsons, who was the partner of a much better known Haymarket radical. That's written by Jacqueline Jones, which is fantastic. One of the authors in our volume, Nancy's in my volume, Kimberly Hamlin, has a book called Free Thinker about a pioneering feminist. So I think some of the biographies are great. Nick Salvatore's Eugene Debs is still the standard book on Debs, which is fantastic. Since Nancy won't do it, I'll highlight her Fightin' Bob La Follette, which is a fantastic biography of one of the most important progressive figures of the era, one I think we all should know more about. So those are a few. I think we talked a little bit about how the era has been understood. So I would point us back to some of the critical takes, like Gabriel Kolko talked about the triumph of conservatism. There's Eldon Eisenach and some others have written about like the lost promise of progressivism. You might also go back to the iconic figures. John Morton Blum wrote about all the progressive presidents. There's a neat little volume, which is actually quite a good read, but it reifies some of the stuff we were saying, scholars don't really buy into now. It's Roosevelt, it's Wilson, it's Roosevelt, those kind of figures, hey, as kind of quintessentially progressive presidents. And then I think he ends that with Lyndon Johnson. as a quintessentially progressive president, admittedly well outside the progressive era. So, those are a few. I mean, there's lots of great books on populism. Charles Postel has a fantastic book. I mean, I think you can't understand this period or American politics today without going to that. Michael Kazin's book, Populist Persuasion, is actually a real model for how to undo work on kind of idea systems as they change over time. We started with this question of, can you put back into an era language that the historical actors didn't necessarily believe in. And Kazin's book is a masterpiece in thinking about how particular rhetorics can inflect people's language and thinking, even when they're not thinking in those terms at all. And that's been really influential to me in my thinking about internationalism and isolationism, because even if people don't call themselves internationalists or isolationists, if they're advancing all or many of the constituent arguments, I think we as historians can make the judgment that they're advancing a kind of internationalist or isolationist claim. So I'd say thinking about populism, particularly as it's in its 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 form, would be useful to link up with Kazin and Postel's work in particular.
And I mean, I think that was brilliant. I mean, I think you hit so many of the books that I would include as well. I would also add, though, that there are a number of really good collections. I'm thinking of one by the links of just documents from the period. And I think that in addition to all of these wonderful secondary sources, and there's such a wealth there, I wouldn't overlook just letting people speak for themselves. And so that would be the only thing that I would add.
No one can see this because, of course, this is audio, but we're all furiously nodding our heads as each other speaks, because these are, I mean, they're wonderful books. And of course, we've got to add Twain and Warner to this list. Is if people can go back and you can get it on audiobook for free now. I mean, listen to it and try and get to grips with what exactly they're talking about. So, okay, so there's a lot of books to add to the reading list this week for sure. The other question is probably the hardest question I ask. What single object can help tell the story of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era?
Well, this is, I don't know, I kind of go back to the basics here. I would want to take a look at the 9th floor lock of the Triangle Factory fire. So this was the lock that was brought into the courtroom. And so, I mean, I think it just opens up all of these discussions about, the Triangle Factory fire is so perhaps overused, but really as sort of a Gilded Age and Progressive Era sort of classic event. And so this lock was brought in to show that these workers were in fact locked into this burning factory. And so it gives you all of the Gilded Age horrors, but also the fact that there is a trial and there are efforts after this fire to make sure that we have fire safety and standards and so forth. So I think this one lock sort of, literally can be used to unlock sort of this whole this whole period. So that would be that would be one that I would recommend.
That's fantastic, and so metaphoric, just like the Gilded Age as well, like you say. Fantastic. Okay, Chris.
I had two in mind again, but Nancy's was the more iconic dystopian element of the era, right? The tragedy of all those workers and people jumping out of the windows and dying. So I'll go the other direction. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, the light bulb. I've just been thinking about the light bulb lately, working late into the night, trying to finish a book, and so 1879, 1880, there are lots of museums that have the incandescent bulb that Edison, patented. But I'm actually thinking about the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which we all teach. I mean, it's almost boring to us and it's so illuminating to students, literally, right? And so I'm thinking May 1st, 1893, Grover Cleveland hits this button and 100,000 incandescent bulbs go on in the city there. And every report, everybody who visited was struck by the amazing power of lights in that period, illuminating the city there, and the Westinghouse AC distribution supply chains and this and that. There's all these great articles and essays written on this. We could make the show notes only on that. But just think about the power of the light bulb, changing what night meant for people, changing what safety meant in urban places, the spectacle of that exposition, the US on the world scene. That's just an amazing moment, a really positive kind of a moment of what technology could make possible for human experience. And then the dystopian side is what Nancy mentioned, right? That part of corporate capitalism was, this underside of sweatshops and labor injustices. And, they go hand in hand, right? And that's partly why I think we really love studying this period and also despise some of the historical actors and moments that we teach and write about.